All right, fam. Well, thank y'all so much for pulling back up and rocking with your boy Cam. Just another wonderful day in the land of web development. Today, I want to continue building on the application that we started talking a little bit about last time we connected, which was basically meant to be an app that shows us the main, let's say, um, all of the main kind of design principles that come up when we work with React, right? And so to do that, I kind of mocked up this very simple app that is going to allow for us to work on creating a React app that has really all the core features of a typical app in the React landscape. What I mean by that is clearly, as you can see, this app isn't basic in terms of what's going on here. We have like a table, we have a form, and as you can see through some of these GIFs I made, we have the interactivity, right? As a user is typing in the form, things are adding to the table dynamically, and the app itself is going to hold eventually a big list of links that we could consider our favorite links. Users then would be able to remove those links and continue to make progress on the application, using the application as they might, right? The reason I said that this application is a good application for us to work on and to show off the React kind of core concepts is because it has a lot of these features inside of it that really will make it so that you have to understand how you set up these React projects, right? So clearly on the first side, with all of the UX that we see going on and the user interfaces that are being acted upon, there's clearly going to be a number of components that we're going to need, right? React components are essentially the building block of all of the UI here. So everything from the form to the table to the container holding the form and the table, right? To the buttons, like all these things we're going to have to put those things into code, right? And to use JSX and JavaScript to write that code so React can eventually turn it into the HTML that we see on the actual website. So clearly we're going to need some components, right? Some of the other features that we're going to need in order to make this work is we're going to need to make use of state, right? And React state is really important when we're building applications where maybe through user interactions or certain other factors within our app, data inside of a component will be changing, right? And we'll see in a second where that comes into play, specifically within the form. As you can see, right, using the form, I have to be able to keep track of what data is the user is typing in, right? That's one, is just like what data is the user typing in. But I need to make sure I keep a record of that data such that I'm able to then send it to the table, right? And so now in the process of sending the data from the form to the table, we're introduced to the third and most other important React feature that we're using, which is props, right? Being able to say, okay, well, from one component, I want to send data to another component. And again, the only way for us to send data from one component to another is by way of props. So this application has quite a bit of, for a simple app, right, that's not too overbearing, I guess, to look at and understand what's going on. It does come with a lot of those connect the dot moments, hopefully, that get you thinking about how does React components, props, and state, how do those things all connect to one another, right? So if you get what I mean, just give me a thumbs up, right? If you see what I'm saying here, just looking at this app, maybe you started working on it and you notice, okay, well, in order for this app to work, I need to understand these components. I need to understand things with state, and I have to understand some stuff with the props. Yeah, definitely. I see y'all. So let's dive into the code and just talk about the code so far and then get into how we will finish this app up with connecting those different dots. So I'm just going to switch over to VS Code and make sure that I am able to show y'all the code here. And I think we're all seeing it. Cool. And so this is a Vite application that we started to basically build out all of those core components. And if you followed along with me in the last video, when we started building this out, we got to the point where we had a solid kind of form structured out with like some data for the form to show up. We had the table and we kind of worked on the table together and built a table component that had two other custom components inside of it, the table header and the table body. And then we had this link container component that wrapped everything together, right? So the link container is actually the component responsible for holding all of those different components and rendering them to the screen. And then our app is just saying, hey, let me just show you all the link container, right? So technically speaking, if I were to be reverse engineering this app, let's say I started a job and somebody's like, hey, Cam, I'm going to pay you to start working on this app called Favelinks. It's my startup. We're going to be making a lot of money together. And I want you to come in and help me as an engineer, right? All right. All cap aside about getting paid. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe I do want to work on this project, right? And so I get on the job, and the first thing I want to do anytime I'm looking at a new project, whether it's JavaScript, Python, whatever it is, right? I want to read through the code to get a sense of understanding of what's going on, right? So with any application that you're working in the JavaScript space, it's going to be really important for you to understand how are those JavaScript files being executed and what maybe libraries are they using to package and run those JavaScript files. All React applications have slightly similar structures to them, but each React component, each React CLI, like, the tools that we use to launch a React project, structure the project slightly different. In the Vite app situation, right? We know we're looking at a Vite app here because of a couple different things. One, we see this vite.config file that gets started when someone launches a new Vite project. That's one. Also, within the package.json, if we take a look, the package.json is really the main file. In any JavaScript project, the package.json is the main file you want to take a look at in order to know what's going on in the project, right? The reason why is because the package.json will also tell you certain things like, hey, based on the scripts that are being written in the package.json, you'll get a sense of, okay, well, maybe how is this project meant to be run? Right. So if there are based on the scripts here on the left-hand side, the keys on the left-hand side, these are the scripts available for us to run npm run something on. So if I want to run this project, it looks like, okay, I can use a dev script. I can use a build script. There's a lint script and a preview script. Clearly, the dev script is when we're developing like a project, those will be the scripts you might use while you're working on a project yourself as a developer. Ultimately, when you're getting ready to push that project to production, that's when you start doing things like building, right? And then some of these libraries have, you allow for you to also create your own scripts, right? And so they created in the Vite app, created a script to lint our project, which really just kind of checks our JavaScript for syntax things. And the preview script, to be honest, I haven't even really ran the preview script yet, so I can't even cap and tell y'all what it really does. But I'm sure it does something cool, like helping us preview our apps or whatnot. If anybody knows what the preview app does, preview script does, or you test it out, drop in the chat what it does. For now, right, as a developer, we're going to be using the dev script, right, clearly to just launch our project. And so that's what I did down here in the terminal. So in the new terminal window, go ahead, and if you're following along and you have the code, the starter code, same as me, just go ahead and run npm run dev on this project, and that will launch the Vite server, and the Vite server will host your application on a particular port for you to take a look at. While y'all go ahead and do that, I'll keep talking a little bit about some of what's going on also in this project, right? I'm not going to go through all of the files. Again, we've done that a couple times when we've talked about how Vite apps are set up. But again, the main kind of project files that we care about in React are going to be whatever is the main component being rendered. And in Vite, there's a file called main.js, and other apps it's called index.js. But this file really kind of holds the structure of how our app gets called, right? So in this app, we have our app from the app.jsx being imported and being rendered. So clearly, anything that's inside of the app.jsx is going to be rendered onto our screen. Because in my app.jsx, like I showed y'all before, I'm importing the link container component that I built. It's a custom component called link container, right? I'm importing that custom component and I'm rendering it here in the return statement for the function. Remember, all functions in React and JSX are very simply just functions that are meant to return some JSX. JSX would be like this short, would be like these HTML looking like syntax for the JavaScript that eventually turns our JavaScript code into actual HTML elements that correlate to these particular elements. We have elements themselves, JSX elements, but we also can create our own, what we call custom JSX or custom components of JSX that we can then refer to like we're doing with the link container, right? So again, React is all about this idea of JSX and custom components, right? Custom components are just also other functions that we define that are meant to return some JSX. So in our link container, if we go over there real quick, we can see that, again, this is just another function, right? That function is eventually, after doing some other stuff, right, is just going to return some JSX, right? And that JSX might also include some custom components. So if you understand this piece, right, about the React components, just give me a thumbs up, because that is a good important point to just be able to say, hey, I understand that piece at least, right? That we need these components, we use them to structure the visual elements, and we can import new components into other components over time, right? So if you understand that, definitely give yourself a pat on the back, because that itself is like one of the most core parts of understanding these React projects. And I know that it's kind of a different type of understanding when you go from regular HTML all the way back to like kind of this JavaScript like HTML landscape. What also gets a little tricky, right, is clearly these functions don't have to just be returning the data, right? Inside of these functions, we can do all types of stuff. We can define new variables. We can define other new functions that might be called from within this function, right? So clearly, as we build out the rest of this project, we're going to see a lot more sophisticated JavaScript being used to get our project running. So again, the link container, we built it out to just be a big container, which it's wrapped in a div, and the div is holding our heading, our paragraph, the table component, H1 heading for just to preview what's happening with the form. And the table and the form components are the other two custom components we built out. Let's start with the form because it's a little more simple right now, right? So the form component is just essentially just using an HTML form, a JSX version of that, the JSX form element. And that form element is just a container for different form elements. And you can have there's a lot of different form elements. Some of the ones that are common, labels, inputs, text areas. We're not using a text area, but if you wanted that like multi-line paragraph kind of thing, you could use a text area. But labels and inputs are kind of some of the more standard form elements that you'll probably want to get familiar with, right? Again, if we take a look at our actual mockup, the labels are the things on top of these boxes. These boxes are the inputs, right? We want to use those inputs to type stuff in, and eventually we want a button that we can use to submit what we've typed in and then send that data over to the table. And we can do that also with an input as well as with a regular button. There's two ways you can create kind of like a submit system for your form. One way is to use just an input. And as you can see, input is the same for both the like boxes that you're typing in as well as this button in this case. The thing that's different is this type attribute here. So the type of the input can change. The text type gives you that box for typing. The submit type gives you a button that you can use to trigger your form to submit. So clearly, the form element is comprised of a lot more JSX, right? There's just a little bit more JSX in there, but it's just returning that JSX, and really that's all there is to our form. Our table, on the other hand, was similar at first, right? We had a table element and we put some of the table data inside of here. But we had a conversation toward the end of our last time meeting where I was like, look, eventually we're going to have so much different pieces of data, and it's going to be a little hard for us to see this data all at once, right? So I had recommended maybe we break up what we're doing with the table header from the table body, so that we can show, hey, one, the table header can be its own thing, and the table body can also be its own thing. Part of the reason I wanted to do this, not only just for the sake of code cleanliness, right? As you can see from this particular bit of code, this is pretty simple to read, right? You might not know off first glance, well, what the table header is doing, what the table body, well, what the table header is supposed to say, or what the table body is supposed to do in terms of what kind of data is going to be returned. But if you read through this code, right, and let's just say you were reading this code for the first time, like I was saying, like you just started working somewhere. Well, looking at this, I'd be like, okay, boom. So there's this table function component, and this component is returning a table, and it has a table header and a table body, right? And that's where at least I can stop that mental train of thought until I start saying, well, now let me take a look at the table header, right? And here I could see, well, the table header is also just a component, and that component is returning something, an element that allows us to create a table header. The table header has three columns to it: a name, a URL, and a remove column. Dope. So if we go back to the table, that's what the table header is doing, right? So we could theoretically replace all of this stuff that we see here from lines 3 to 10 could exist on could exist right here in our table on line 38, right? So if I had pasted all of that there, the only difference would be that this table would just be a lot longer in terms of the code that is required for us to have it here, right? The table body, right, is a little bit more complex. And if you follow along in the last video, we didn't actually get this far into what the table body is doing, but in the GitHub link, when you start this project, or if you follow along with the GitHub code that I sent out, the table body, I added some code into it. And let's talk a little bit about that code and what's going on here. So the table body is always going to be responsible for creating rows of data, right? So a row of data is going to correlate to the data that will come from each cell in the table that says, that should put the data for what the headers are representing, right? So if I have a header that says, hey, you know, I'm going to have name, URL, and remove, well, each row in my table body should have some of that data defined, right? It doesn't have to have all of the data defined, right? You can maybe have a row that doesn't have a name or doesn't have a URL or doesn't have a remove button. But again, the point of the table is that, hey, I define these columns as the top of the header of the table. Then I would expect that each row would contain at least some of that data, right? And that's what we see here. If let's just zoom in and focus in on like lines 19 to 27. I'll set these breakpoints here so you see what I'm talking about, right? 19 to 27, right? 19 is the start of the table row, right? That is going to be kind of like this row of data. And then each table row contains table data as children elements. So if I close all of the table datas, you can see here's one set of table data, here's a second set of table data, and here's a third set of table data, right? Again, the table data corresponds to the cells inside of the row that theoretically correspond to the columns that we asked for in the table header, right? So this first piece of data would correspond to the first column of data, right? The second piece of data will correspond to the second piece of data, et cetera, right? So that's why we have three table data objects here, right? The table data object is itself kind of just a container for other pieces of data, right? So you can put other pieces of data inside of a table data cell. In our case, right, the type of data that I care about is a name, a URL, and then this remove button, right? If we go back to the image, right? Again, it's just very simply, we care about having names, the URL, and then that remove button coming up. So to do all of this, right, to be able to have the code do this, we're going to create rows of data that have those pieces of information defined. Now, if I were focusing in again on lines 19 to 27, if this represents one row of data, right, and inside of that one row of data, I will have like a name, I'll have a link, a URL, and then I'll have a button, right? Zooming back out for a second. Imagine, right, if this is what one row of data looks like, imagine what my code will look like down here if I had 100 rows of table data in here, right? It would start to look pretty crazy down here, right? Not only that, if I had also included that table header code, right, it'd almost be a little hard to discern between the table row that is for the header and then the table rows that are for all of the body data, right? And as the body grows, we're just gonna have more and more rows of data that we're gonna just be seeing over time inside of our table, right? Give me a thumbs up if you're seeing and understanding what I'm saying here, right? Part of the reason we wanted to switch this into being its own component was because of the fact that, hey, you know, I really don't want my table to start looking so crazy that it's hard to read. But then two, over time, I'm gonna have to update this table and it's going to only grow, right? So keeping things separate is just meant to help me keep the code clean, but also it's just kind of strategic because, hey, going back to the table body, this component itself might needs to do a lot to really grow. And that's why we created this version of the table row for the table body that is dynamic. Now, let me talk to you about what that means, because again, this goes into if the first step to understanding React is understanding components, then an intermediate look at the components would be the way that we're creating these table row components here for our table, right? Clearly, this is a table row, right? I think we all can agree on that just from looking at the code. But as you can see, I have some interesting kind of pieces of data defined inside of the table data. And you might be like, okay, yeah, Cam, I just want to know, well, why are you calling like row.name here? Or where's like row.url and stuff coming from? So let's talk about that in the context of how can we make it so that when we are, let's see, this table row has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 lines of code, right? Well, if I have 100 rows of data, is that going to be like 700 lines of code, right? All to just kind of repeat the same structure and just kind of change the name and the URL and the button again and again, right? That's not realistically kind of the best way to structure our code, because we're repeating data over and over again, right? To just kind of show you what I mean, let me just pretend for a second we take away the table body and I actually keep the table body in here into the table, just like before. Basically, like I was saying, right? The way that the table works is here, I can define some information, right? And inside of the table data, each of these pieces of information, let me say name one, URL one, and then button. Instead of having this here, let's just make a simple button so we can see. Right. So technically, right, I'm going to have all these rows of data, and the rows of data are going to consist of the data for each part of the table, right? And so if I save this and I go back to my version of the code as it stands right now, you'll see, right, that my version of the code, I have my table with name one, URL one, and button one up here, right? So clearly that worked for showing the data in the body. But again, if I want to have 3 rows of data in this body, I'm going to have to basically duplicate this, right, to have another table row. And then I'm going to have to change this to say name 2, URL 2, button 2, right? Saving this, then I go back to the when I go back to my actual application, you can see now that I have 2 rows in that particular table. Again, if I want 3 rows, hopefully y'all are seeing what I'm saying here now, right? If I want 3 rows, now I got to go ahead and I got to copy this again, right? And I got my 3rd row. All of that code just to have these same 3 rows. But if you really look at it, right, this code is the same code. The only thing that's changing is the data inside of the data of these particular table data cells, right? So give me a thumbs up if you're seeing what I'm saying. 1, that, okay, this is how the body of the data is getting structured. But 2, that, hey, you know, realistically, it's the same format, right, for each row. We're just changing kind of this inside part of the data. in each row, right? If you see that, just give me a quick thumbs up, because that is part of the challenge here. Is like we don't want to have all this repetitive code anywhere, right? Now, repetitive code is a sign that there's a more efficient way to structure this. And thankfully there is, right? And with React, we have a lot of different ways we can go about making this code a lot better, right? One thing to think about is this, all of these rows of data are gonna have to come from somewhere, right? So clearly, because this is a list of data, we might represent this list of data as like an array, right? Arrays are great data objects for storing lists of data in an ordered way, right? So this is all very orderly. So it might be great to actually have like an array that has all of the data points for our table row inside of it, right? Whether or not it's just, hey, all of these table rows are in an array, or hey, we can store some data that has like each of these objects defined inside of it, and we can use these objects to then more dynamically create the data for our table off of the data in that array, right? To get a sense of what I mean there, like that is essentially what I was doing when we created this version of the table body up here. Now, there's a couple pieces to this, so I'll break it down. The first piece is, let's pretend for a second, we're not even using props yet. Let's pretend I have some array of row data, right? So like I have row data 1, row data 2, right? Row data 3, right? So this array is just gonna have a little bit of data for each row of my table, right? Well, what would this function do realistically if that was the case? If given some array of row data, I'm calling the dot map function on that array. The dot map function is a very special array method, because what it does is it goes through an array that you give it, and it says, okay, given this array that you gave me, right, I'm gonna go ahead and loop through each element. And for every element that I see, I will run a function that you define for me. And here's the best part also. Not only will I run this function that you give me, if the function returns something, right, whatever the function returns, I will give you back an array that has the same length as the array you gave me, but the new array will contain the values of everything that you returned from the function that you called on each item inside of the original array. So that means that for this function, right, we gave it this array of 3 random pieces of data, row data, and it's going to map over it. So it's going to create a new array off of each item that is in here. But for each item that's inside of this array, we're going to call this function right here. And this function is going to refer to each row data object as a row. And we also can get a sense of the index of that row data in the array, right? So this one's at index 0, this one's at index 1, this one's at index 2. So basically we're saying, hey, run this function, this one right here, on all of the elements inside of this particular array, and then return a new array with the result for each item that we end up seeing. That's essentially what a map function does. The reason a map function is really helpful for React is because we can return for every piece of random data, right? For every object of data that we get, we can return some JSX and say, hey, in my new array, I just want an array of JSX. The cool thing about having an array of JSX is that if I put an array of JSX, right? So this rows will eventually become an array of JSX elements. If I put an array of JSX inside of a return statement of a function, it will process it like regular JSX. It'll show it like an actual list of the JSX in there. So that's one of the cooler things about how arrays and array methods can make your life easier, especially when you're repeating yourself with how you're defining maybe certain JSX elements, right? So clearly here, instead of continuously saying, hey, I need a new table row, and each table row will have these pieces of data, right? If I use a map, I can say, hey, for every item in this array of data that I'm gonna get, I'm gonna create a new row, right? And that new row will have, there will be a space for the name, there will be a space for me to create a link with the URL that's passed in. And then there'll be a space for me to also create a button. And then that button, I'm just gonna default it to say delete. And eventually I can create functions for that button to do stuff, right? Here I'm alluding to how I'm gonna do that, but hopefully you get the picture without seeing this and getting a little confused. We'll talk about that in a second, right? What I'm doing instead of continuously copy and pasting all of these rows is I'm using a logic saying, hey, I'm gonna expect that all the rows are gonna be passed as an array. If they're passed as an array, then for every item in the array, each row in the array, right? Each data of row, each data from my rows in the table, right? I'm going to say for all of those rows, right? Return a new JSX element. It'll be a table row, right? And that row will have a name, URL, and a button inside of it, right? And that, my friends, allows me to use this particular array that's going to get returned here in rows as a part of this JSX expression on line 31, where we're saying, okay, bet. So I'm going to then return a table body with those particular rows of data. Now, again, how we're going to do that is important to make sense of, but we're going to talk about that in a second, because we're going to use props to do this, and I'll explain why in a second. But just if the fundamental concept logically makes sense, right? Hey, okay, let's say I give you an array of data and I want you to return to me all of the rows, like create table rows for each of those lines of data, right? If that idea makes sense to you, just give me a quick thumbs up, because just want to get a kind of gauge check on that. I know is a more sophisticated way of us creating JSX dynamically. But hopefully you can see how that's going to save you a lot of time, so you don't have to create all these copy paste things. You could just use an array and say, hey, I'm going to create one thing, but then I'm going to expect that the one thing will change through the way that I'm calling this array mapping function. Dope. So I saw some folks with their thumbs up. I appreciate that. And if you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat so myself or some of our colleagues can address it. Because yeah, I understand, fam. By no means an easy thing to grasp on first glance. It takes some time working with arrays and using data like this to really get a sense of it. But this is a fundamental concept in terms of how we take those React components and make them a little bit more dynamic in terms of how we structure our code with them, especially when they're repeating and there's lists of data. So now that we kind of understand the fundamental concept, the last piece about this is, where will this array of data come from, right? Well, great. Okay, maybe y'all are like, okay, maybe I get it, Cam. Like maybe I kind of get if there is a array of data that would be lit, and I'm kind of rocking with you on the fact that I could use this map function and basically use this function to create JSX for each item in the array, right? And you're telling me now that for each item in this array, right, I could take the information from that particular item and then use it in this JSX. Maybe that makes sense, right? But still the question remains, well, where is that array of that magical dope array going to come from, right? Like it's not going to come from just thin air, right? I can't just define it like this with row data 1, row data 2, row data 3, right? It has to come from somewhere, right? The answer to this question is kind of simple, and I feel like it's kind of annoying that it's simple, and we're going to explain where it really is going to come from after I explain this, right? The table body, think about it. The table body is just kind of like a random component inside of this table .jsx file, right? The table body is kind of unreachable right now. The only way for any part of our app to get into the table body is to be, one, inside of this particular bit of code that is structured in our table.jsx, meaning the only place where we realistically can access the table body and pass in some data like this is inside of our table when we are rendering our table body, right? Our table body only kind of exists as a part of the table, right? It's not exported at all. We can't call the table body. We're not calling the table body inside of here. We could export it, but it doesn't really make sense to, because the point of the table body is to just support us creating a table, right? The table is realistically the main component of this file. We have a header and a body inside of it. The body, then, if we want some data to be given to the table body, right, we got to figure out, well, how is it going to get sent down to this table body? And the answer, my friends, is through props, right? The only way for me to pass data from one component to another component, even if it's a component in the same file, right, is through props, right? Because there's one place where I'm actually calling the table body to be created, and that's here inside of the table, right? So this table component is going to call to create a table header and call to create a table body, right? The table body at this point is the only place where I could say, hey, table, pass some data to the table body so it has it to use, right? And to do that, I can use props. So I could say, hey, I'm going to pass some data to the table, to my table body for it to use to then maybe do all of these things, right? So maybe instead of having like an array just kind of randomly in here like this, I might pass a prop to my table body that has the data for all of my links that I'm going to save, right? So let's say, for instance, I call that piece of data link data, right? So maybe this table body will receive a prop, right? Like maybe down here, I'll say, okay, this table body is going to receive a prop called link data, right? And that link data will be an array of eventually the data from my rows of data, right? If that is the case, then this all will make sense, right? So the table will pass into the table body a prop for its link data. And it'll say, hey, table body, here's an array of data that you can use, right? The table body says, all right, bet, I'm going to receive some props and I'm going to use that link data prop you just told me I have. And I'm going to then do all the stuff that I originally said I would do to that array. So I'm expecting that the link data is going to be an array because what I want to do is map over it and do all of these things. That's it. Say less. The table body's like, if you pass me those props, I will be able to do this effectively, right? The table is like, cool. So I'll pass you the props and that's it, right? So the table now has a responsibility to the table body that it has to pass those props because as you can see, the table body is kind of already defined like it's expecting those props, right? It's expecting that a prop.link data is existing so that it can map over it and create all of these table rows and table datas, etc. Right? So give me a thumbs up if you kind of understand that flow a little bit more now that now we broke it down, right? The table body is going to be responsible for passing some link data to our table. The table is going to be responsible for passing some link data to our table body. That link data is going to be an array of data that we can then use to make this whole mapping function work to our benefit. Now, for the folks who said that it made sense, I'm glad that it did. For those that didn't, again, I encourage you to drop a question or anything in the chat so I can help you out if there's a way for me to re-explain it. Otherwise, maybe just seeing it is good enough. My question to the folks who said they understand it is looking at the table body code that you see here, right, from lines 14 to 29, well, 14 to 31, I should say. I should zoom out just one more time so you can see the whole thing. From 14 to 31, we have our table body defined, but let's just take a look at this section 17 to 29 for the rows of the table, right? Looking at this section that I highlighted here, right, we talked about, okay, well, props.link data exists here, so we need to use it. What is, given the way that this section is defined, what is another piece of data that is expected to be passed into our table body for us to use here in order to make this table body work? I'm sure that question sounds more challenging than it actually is, right? Clearly, we're using and expecting some props in here for the link data, right? And I'm sure y'all are seeing there's some other props that are defined here that we need, right? So hopefully giving you enough time to pause and see that yourself. And I see some folks in the chat. Thank you so much, right? The other piece of data that this table body is saying, hey, I'm going to be responsible for is something related to this button, right? If you look closely, this button is a very simple button. It's just a button. It has a name for delete. And then here it has this function that's getting called whenever it gets clicked. The function says, hey, whenever I get clicked, I'm going to run this function that is essentially is me calling props.remove link, right? So where is this props.remove link? You know, again, we're using props. So we're basically defining data that doesn't exist yet for us unless we've passed it in from the table, right? So clearly, in addition to the link data that I need to pass to the table body, I'm also going to need to pass some remove link system, a function that I can call in from our table to do something, right? So again, passing props is the only way for us to send data from one thing to the other. I can send data like an array, but I also can send data like a whole function. So let's say handle remove, right? And I'm just going to make this a nice little arrow function. And this handle remove function, I can pass into the table body as props. I can say, hey, I'm going to give you a function called remove. I'll give you a prop called remove link. And that prop is you just calling our handle remove function, right? By doing this, now whenever our table row says, okay, I'm ready to call props.remove link on, like, hey, this button got clicked. What this is saying is, okay, cool. Call that remove link function that our parent component passed into us and pass back this index number to that particular function. So here we're saying, okay, cool. So whenever you call remove link, you're really going to just call handle remove. But handle remove, as you can see now, okay, well, we're going to expect that it's passing back an index from the table body. So we're saying, okay, well, handle remove is going to then get some index, right? And here I might want to do something to that index. So I'll just, for now, kind of just console log the, button clicked and then the index, right? Just to see what happens whenever that's getting clicked. But now, as hopefully now this is making a little bit more sense to folks, right? Our table is doing some sophisticated pieces of things related to how it's breaking up the code. But more than that, what's really important is the fact that because we've broken up this component into separate components, right? A header and a body, for instance, we need to use props to pass in certain key bits of information that will just make our lives a lot easier so that our table body can be created dynamically. Now, by passing all that pieces of data in, right, the table body never has to grow from this many lines of code. Why? Well, because the thing that's changing here is going to be props.link data, right? This is the only thing that determines the size of our table is, well, what's the size of props.link data, right? Because again, this array is what's going to be mapped over to eventually create our rows of data. So we effectively created a dynamic component that will grow based on the size of the prop that we give it. So if I say that this array is going to be seven objects long, well, I would expect that because this array is 7 objects long, the map will also be 7 objects long, but it'll be 7 objects that are also JSX. And those JSX objects then will correspond to what we're seeing in our table body inside of the table, right? So to demonstrate that a little bit more, we have now, if I save this, then let's just take a look and make sure nothing's breaking here. You might have experienced, if you were following along and you're using the default code from the project, right? If you just ran the dev environment with just kind of without any of these props that we just passed in, you might see that your dev environment is going to run, but everything's going to be blank. And you'll be like, well, why is this blank? What's going on here? Well, if you looked at the inspector, right, you'd see that there's some uncaught errors here. Well, it's saying uncaught type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading map. Okay, at table body. Okay, so this error is kind of interesting. Uncaught type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading map, right? It's very important when you see something that's weird going on in your app, pull up in the console so you can take a look to see if you're getting any errors or warnings. The uncaught error here is really important. It's saying, hey, I cannot read properties of something that's not defined. Right now, you're asking me to read a map, and I don't know. You're asking me to read a map on something that right now doesn't exist. And it's saying that it doesn't exist. We're calling it a table body at table.jsx row line 17, right? So this error is really helpful. It's going to show you exactly where you got to fix your code. So if I go to the table.jsx line 17, we see that, oh, this is here. This rows this link data situation. Well, it's saying props.linkdata.map. And remember, the error was saying, hey, I cannot read properties of undefined. Well, right now, you're telling me to read map. So I can't read this map property of something that's undefined. So if we look back here, it's saying, okay, well, the dot map is saying, hey, I can't actually call this because the thing you're telling me to call this on is undefined. Well, the thing that's undefined right now is props.linkdata, right? Well, I know that this error itself isn't realistically spelling this out for us in very common sense, no-brainer way for the new developers here that are working. But the idea is this: I can't call .map on something that doesn't exist, and it's basically saying, hey, well, you're calling props.linkdata, but props.linkdata doesn't exist. And the only way for props.linkdata to exist is if I defined a prop here called link data. Again, like if I had a prop called link data in here, then that error will go away. But let's say I put link data here, but instead of it being an array, I gave it like a random number or something different. Well, now I'm going to get a different array, a different issue here, right? Well, now it's saying props.linkdata.map is not a function. So clearly that first error went away because props.linkdata exists, but now it's saying, hey, .map is not a function. Well, that's because the .map function only works on arrays. So as soon as I turn this back into an array, you can see that not only is this error gone, right? I'm getting some warnings, and we'll talk about maybe some of these warnings in a second. But not only is that error gone, I'm getting back to seeing my app again. Right. So the reason I wasn't seeing the app before was because I didn't define a prop called link data that my table body could read. And in order for the error to go away itself, I have to make sure that what I pass in as a prop for the link data is an array that can be mapped on, because an empty array can still be mapped over even though there's no data inside of the array, right? When it looks at props.linkdata, it's going to see an empty array and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to loop through all the elements. Oh, there's no elements. No problem. I'm going to return kind of an empty array. And that's how we get this empty table up here. So if nothing else, I'm just saying all this to say, we're doing this for a reason, in order to use the fact that with the array, we can grow our data over time. To show you that last point again of like, let's say hypothetically, I have a couple pieces of information inside of this array. For now, I'll just put like a couple strings. Strings aren't the data type that I want in here, and I'll explain why in a second. But let's say I have 4 strings in here. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to see, well, I'm going to actually have 4 rows in my table. And I know that these are 4 rows in my table because I see I have 4 buttons. The reason I have 4 buttons is because, again, the table map function that we defined said, hey, for every row, create a name, a URL, and a button, right? The button itself doesn't rely on any kind of prop data. It just says, hey, create a button that says delete and make sure, oh, well, it does rely on this one prop data. And if that button gets clicked, we're going to call this prop function, right? So technically, if I go ahead and click this button, I'm going to get some issues because the prop doesn't exist, right? And I can see that if I go back to the console, props.remove link is not a function, right? That aside, I can still see the buttons because the buttons themselves, the UI of the button, right, is still able to be created. It's created a button that says delete. That's all that it needed to do visually. The reason the row name and the URL didn't show up is because, well, how does this map function work? Well, remember, the map function is going to take this link data array, right? This link data array is going to be passed here as props right here, and we're going to map over it. And the map function says, take the element that we're looking at inside of this array and run the function on it. So I said, hey, for every element in this array, I'm going to refer to that element as a row, right? So each element is theoretically a row. Here, this is a row, this would be a row, this would be a row, this would be a row. And each row should have a name and a URL defined in it. Again, these are not really, this again is not, what's the way I want to describe this? It's not spelled out entirely easy to see, but the way that declarative code, right? Remember, React is all about declarative code. So I'm saying I'm going to pass you a row object with a name and the row object with a URL. It's my fault if I don't actually pass you that, right? The table is like, the table body is like, look, I'm lit, I'm cool. You pass me that stuff, we good. You know what I'm saying? Like, but if I don't pass it, clearly I'm going to have these issues like this where now I'm not actually seeing that data, right? So for me to fix this, I need to make sure that the items that I'm passing into the link data have those properties defined in them. I need it to have a name and have a URL inside of it. And these aren't just any, this can't be a string, right? Because look at how this is defined. It's row.name, row.url. So what I already said it. what data type do I want to use? I want to use an object, right? Because objects give us this ability to do this dot syntax, right? So in order to fix this, I need not only this link data to exist, I need it to not be strings. I need it to be objects where each object has a name, and a name and a URL, right? And I got to be careful because the way that it's defined in a table body is the way that it needs to be defined in my link data for it to actually show up correctly on my table. So row.name, row.url with all caps on the URL side. So here, if I have a name and I say, let's say React docs, and the URL is https:/react.dev, right? Well, now I have defined a piece of data. That data has a name and it has a URL. Clearly, those can be strings, but it's important for me to have this whole object because the link data here is going to say, hey, with that array, I have one object for one row, and that row will be created like so. And I'm going to use the name and the URL you provided me to create that row of data for you, right? So that's what is necessary for me to be able to pass data into the table. Well, let me say, that's what's necessary for the table to have data-wise in order to show a full row. It needs a name and it needs a URL and it needs this delete. And it needs at least that function to delete the button. So again, if I had more objects in here, right, then the more objects I have in here, and I'll just copy this one for now. The more objects I have in here, the more rows of data I'll have, right? And if you look at it, the only thing that's changing is the linked data array. That's the only thing that's changing. I have to do nothing in a table body. That's why writing the code like this is dope, because the table body says, hey, I'm just going to use this array you give me and I will create the rows, right? You don't have to worry about me ever changing because once you give me the array, I'll do the rest, right? The table body and the table component itself doesn't need to change too much, right? The table body is the same. The table header is the same. The only thing that's changing here is the link data of the array, right? Again, the only other piece I have to have for the table body to realistically make sure that it's going to be called right is some reference to a remove link situation here. I need to be able to, like, whenever a function, one of these buttons gets clicked, right? In order for it to not lag like this and give me this error, remove link is not a function, I got to make sure I pass in another prop into my table body here that allows for me to remove a link. So I'm going to create that prop here. And just for now, I'm going to have it say handle remove. And that, again, is that function that we created above here. And now if I go ahead and go and click some of these buttons, right? So I click button, the first button, you can see button clicked 0 at the index, right? Again, same thing, click the second one and button click 1, right? So clearly now our handle remove function is being called from the relative button that triggered it. And when that button gets clicked, it's gonna call that remove link function from our prop, from the parent, right? And it's gonna pass back an index number. The index number, again, comes from the map. When we map through an array, you get not only the ability to name this first element, whatever you want to call it to reference the data, You also can pass in a secondary variable name for your index. So it's common when you see map functions that you'll see something here, you define whatever this is called. For me, I just call it a row. But here you'll see people call this index or I or whatever, right? To keep track of the array index number. So this, my friends, is how we're going to keep our table body being dynamically allocating with regards to all of the data that's passed through the linked data array. Well, our table body will be able to process that without having to keep duplicating all of these table rows, which just saves us a lot of time. So we don't have to, and we're not duplicating code that we've already written here. So I know, again, that's a lot. So just quick thumbs up if that makes sense. Just seeing it. Again, I know it takes a little bit of time and maybe you going back and rewatching this explanation, but that's essentially what we're trying to accomplish here with this setup here with the props. I hope helps you see how, hey, even though all these components are in the same file, we still are going to rely on using props. And if we want to use props effectively, we have to know certain things like, dang, you can pass a function in as props, right? Like that's pretty cool. We can pass arrays as props. And with arrays passed as props, then we can do really cool things like dynamically allocating certain JSX based on that particular array. So enough about the table. Let's talk about the rest of the app, right? And so to do that, let's go back to this main piece of information here. This app, like what we've got so far, kind of represents this top part, right? Minus some styling things. But the top part is kind of already there. We got the ability to show multiple rows of data. But here's the actual part that's important. We need to create those rows of data from the form, right? The form is what's going to be responsible for actually creating, well, actually it's like creating a new piece of a new item for our table, right? So given what I just showed you, right? Given what I just showed y'all here of our table header, right? It's safe to say that our form will be creating the data that eventually we should have in our link data, right? Give me a thumbs up if you agree with that statement, right? Given what we saw here with the table, how it works, how the link data is the thing that grows over time, et cetera, right? And given what you're seeing here, right? When we type in the form, what we really need to have happen is this data from the form needs to add to our link data so it eventually will show those rows on the table, right? If you agree with that, give me a quick thumbs up. I saw some folks do it. I feel like we're in agreement here, right? That's what we got to do. Right? Yeah, that's what we gotta do, fam. That literally right there is what we gotta do. don't guess yourself. Don't second guess yourself. You know what I'm saying? If that's what you thought, you were 100% right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I see some folks late throw they thumb up and they're like, yeah. That's what I thought. That's what I meant to say. Yeah, 100%, man. 100%. We need essentially for this application to work, we need to be able to create we need our link data to adjust based on what's being submitted in the form. That's it. So how are we gonna do that? Right? How are we going to do that? Now, pop quiz, because I keep trying to drill this point home for y'all, and hopefully this app does it by the end of the time we're finished building it. If I am going to create data in the form, right? And I want that data to be in the table, that means I want to pass data from the form to the table. Question for y'all, drop in the chat your answer. How do I pass data from one component to another component in React? What is the thing I got to use in order to pass data from one component to another component? We literally just use it right here for our table header and our table body, right? If I want to pass data from one component to another component, what I got to use? Yes, y'all, go ahead. I want everybody to type in the chat. Everybody type props in the chat. Yes, I. 100%. Yeah, yep. There you go, fam. You're doing this to solidify this in your brains right quick. Yes, you have to use props. If I want to pass data from any component to another component, I have to use props. If I'm in the table component and I'm saying, hey, I want to pass some data to the table body, the only way to do that is using props. if I'm in the form and I want to pass data to the table, the only way to do that is using props. If I'm in the table and I want the link container to have, if the link container wants to pass data to the table, I need to use props. No questions asked. If I want data from one component to go to another component, I have to use props. So now we're going from this conversation about components, kind of a little bit more detail on the ways these components can be more sophisticated, especially with like arrays and JSX or whatever, to then we start talking a little bit about props, as we can see here from the table body. But now it kind of gets even further extended into, well, theoretically, this whole app is about taking data from one component, submitting that data from that form, and that data is supposed to go to the table. That realistically is the whole app, right? But the question is, how do you structure an app like this to do that, right? If like y'all so eloquently just said, the only way for us to send data from the form to the table is using props. Well, where then will we pass those props, right? Where will the form pass the prop to the table that we need to send? That is exactly why we need to have this link container element that wraps both of these elements over. Because again, the only way you can pass prop from one component to another is in props. And the only place you can define props is whenever that particular component is being rendered, right? So if I wanted to pass data from the form to the table, the only way to do that is to use props. But the only place I can define the prop is here, right? Prop 1, prop 2, prop 3, right? Wherever I'm creating that actual component. If I wanted to pass data to the form, same thing. I have to be down here and say, okay, prop 2, right? Like this is where I have the opportunity to create and pass props. So the link container is really important, even though it might not seem important at first, right? Because everything's happening in the table and the form. Well, if I want the table if I want to pass data to any of these two components, the only place I can do it is from within the link container. Give me a thumbs up if you see and understand that, given what you know about props and components, right? If I wanted to define props for any of these two custom components, the only way for me to do that is here inside of the link container where they're being rendered, essentially. If I had everything in one place, if this was all in the app.js and everything was in the same place, well, then I could do it there. But because my table is being created outside of the form and the table are in separate files, I'm going to need some component that's rendering them to be the place where I'm going to pass the props. So let's see that in action, right? This means two things, and I'll show you this to you in a simple example. For instance, right here, right? Our link data, this link data is a prop that the table is passing to the table body. But the table, like right here, this link data is kind of just being hard coded in. I'm just creating this table data myself, right? But eventually, I'm going to want this data to be coming from somewhere else. I want this data basically to be coming from the form. The form should be saying, hey, I'm going to type in some stuff. Once you submit it, I'm going to basically pass it to the table for as data, right? So theoretically, what actually needs to happen is this link data shouldn't even be defined here from the table body. It needs to kind of be defined inside of the table, right? We need it to pass down to eventually into the table body, right? But in order for the form to pass the link data, again, the form, the only place it has access to do that is here with the table. So I'm going to move that link data up, and I'm just going to say, okay, cool. We're going to actually define the link data here. Now, we already know from what we were just talking about with the table that that's not going to fly. The table body also needs that link data. So what I'm going to do very simply is take props into the table and say, okay, boom, the table's going to receive some props. And guess what? With those props, I could very easily just say, hey, I'm going to just define some new props for my child element and pass props.link data down to my child. So what I'm saying here is the same process is established, right? We know that the table body needs the link data, but the link data doesn't have to be hard coded here. It actually could be passed in to the table from somewhere else, which is exactly what we're going to do here with the link container. Instead of just having the link data be defined inside of the table, because it doesn't really allow us to change it from inside of the table, right? We're actually going to define the link data as a prop from within the link container. The link container then will give the table its link data as an array. The table will take that link data, and when it renders, it'll say, hey, I got some props called link data. It's props.link data here, right? And I'm just going to pass it down to my table body with the same name. Of course, I could change the name of this prop, right? I could just, I could change it to, I could say, if I changed it here to just be, regular just data, right? Then here, table body, the link data that it's receiving would just be prop.data, right? Doesn't matter what I call it, but the point is that the table is going to be getting this data from outside in the link container. And let's see why as we wrap up building out this application, right? The reason why is like y'all just said, well, theoretically, I want the form to be creating this data that is being passed to the table, because the form then, if it creates it, the only way for me to pass it again is through props, right? So here's my only opportunity to do that. But there's also another hidden reason why the link container is so important. This architecture is kind of a very important architecture for y'all to understand, which is a container component, which is kind of like a wrapper component over two separate components, right? Well, this parent component, the link container, now has availability and the ability to do two things for us. One is it can define props, right? Clearly, I could define a prop like link data now or data here into our table. Secondly, I have the ability to keep track of data that is going to change over time inside of this component itself, the link container component. Now, this is where things get really important. So I want to wrap up building this out, and then we'll see it in action, and we'll talk about it toward the end, right? So what I'm going to do here is let's go back to what we're trying to accomplish, which is how can I have the form, right? Realistically, all I want to accomplish here right now is I have this form. The form has some inputs in it, right? It has these two inputs for the link name and the link URL. Based on what's typed into the form here and when it's submitted, I want to basically take that data and pass it to the table as an object of data. We know we're going to have to pass it as some array, and we know that we need that array to be changing in size based on what's typed in the form. So how are we going to do that, right? Some of y'all, if you were working on the homework, you probably already know. And some of y'all maybe just looking at this, you're kind of getting a sense of what you got to do. But let's take a look at it from the perspective of us building it out. So I have this form, right? Clearly, I have everything I need so far. I have the input, labels, whatever. All that stuff is there. I got a submit button, and that's all good. So what do I want to do? Well, I want it to be able to say, okay, I want people to be able to type into these inputs, and I want to save this data. Well, great. Just by creating a form, I automatically get the ability to I should have the ability, let's see, to connect into these inputs. So I can see here, and I think y'all should be able to see my screen. Yeah, I can click into these inputs. Let me close the console for a quick second just to make sure that's not tripping on me. Okay, cool. So I have the ability to click into these inputs, but as I'm typing, I'm not really seeing anything happen here, right? Nothing's showing up for me as I start to type. I'm clicking a lot of buttons and I'm not seeing anything here. Well, in order for forms to be updated, I have to make use of some of the event handling methods that are built into these JSX elements. And also, actually, now that I see it, the issue is this. I have this value kind of hard coded here. So actually, if I take out this value and keep it like regular, kind of just a regular input, the input with just the text, the ID, and the name, no value kind of defined. You can see that you out of the box, you have the ability to type into your inbox, into your inputs. So let's say I have Cam's website, right? And then my URL would be like HTTPS, github.com/Cam Unity. Let's say get Cam's GitHub, right? So I could type into this already, and I could click submit. But when I click submit, I see that the page reloaded. Oh, interesting. well, that's not what I want to have happen, right? But at least I have that information. So clearly there's a couple pieces I got to fix into the form. So let's do that real quick. The first piece is I can type into the input just fine. But as you can see, whenever I submit, I'm getting the page is reloading, right? Well, that's just a nature of the submit input type. Whenever you use an input of type submit, what this submit button is going to do when it gets clicked is it's going to trigger a method on your form called on submit. It's going to just submit your form. When you submit a form by default, it's going to refresh the page. That's just kind of how it works out of the box. There's two ways we can fix this to make it so it doesn't just refresh our page like this, because we don't really want it to refresh the page. We just want it to send the data to the table. The first way to do this is if I keep input type submit, is to add the event handler for the on submit for when the form gets submitted to my form. By doing this, right, I'm able to create and pass in a function that in this function, I can say, hey, what do I want to do when the form submits? When the form submits, it is an event. Just like when something gets clicked or something gets changed, there is an event object that gets passed back into it. That event object, if I want to prevent it from reloading the page, I can do that by calling a particular method on there that's called prevent default. Event.prevent default will allow for you to say, hey, based on this event that's taking place, I don't want it to refresh the page if it's going to. So now, as you can see, if I go back here, type in Cam's GitHub, put my GitHub and submit, right? I don't have the page refreshing, which is great, at least for that sake. The other way to do this, if I didn't want to do it that way, is instead of using an input of type submit, I could just make this a regular button and then put an on click in there in the button to just do what I want to do. So you have two choices. One way is to use the on submit for the form. The other way would be, instead of using an input of type submit, just make this a button, and then you can put an on click in the button to say, hey, when the button gets clicked, do something. For me, what I want to do is, I would love, right? It would be great if after I've typed in this information here, right? Whenever the form's ready to submit, it would be dope if I could just like kind of like console log the name or the URL or something, right? It would be URL, right? It would be great if I could just kind of console log this out. But here lies an issue for me, right? I don't know why I just did this. My bad, fam. Let me get rid of that. Herein lies the issue. The name and the URL don't exist anywhere, right? When these inputs are being changed, I'm seeing the data in there, but I don't have a way of saving the data. So I need a way to save the data of these inputs as they're being changed. That way I have the latest version of whatever this input is as it's being changed. Now, there is another very important part of React that we need to use when we're thinking about data internal to a component. We're inside of a component, and some data in this component might be changing, and we want to keep track of that changing data over time. What would be the key React feature that we've talked about that might be helpful in this scenario here? Yeah, Salif said it, like state. So everybody in the chat, drop state. That's exactly what we got to do right now. So I need y'all to spam the chat and just say state. Yeah, that's exactly what we need, because we're in a moment right now in this component where what we want to have happen is we want this inputs data. We want to save that data, and we want to change that data over time. Thank y'all. Keep spamming state in the chat. This is for y'all more than it is for me. So let's talk about this and do this at the same time so we can finish on time, right? So theoretically, I want to be able to use state, and I can do that by using the use state hook that comes in React. The use state hook will allow for me to create a new piece of state that could be something like the name. And if I want to change the name, I can give a function to change the name, but I can default the name to be an empty string and say, hey, we'll start empty, and essentially we'll keep track of the name as it's being updated and set it as it's being changed, right? To do that, I can say, hey, for this input that is going to be tracking the name as it's being typed in, right? I can say, I can say, as this input is being changed, on change is an event in that we can use for inputs. It's kind of similar to the on-click, but it's really for inputs in the form. As the form is being changed, I have now the opportunity to define a function to call whenever this input is being changed. I could create a new function, right? So I could say something like const handle change, right? And create a little arrow function for myself like this, right? There's one way, that's one way. And then I could say, hey, whenever the on change is called, call handle change down here, right? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is if I don't want to have a separate function outside like this, you'll see that very commonly people will just create the function, right? And just paste the function down here as like a little function, inline function. This inline function, then inside, I could do stuff like say, hey, when this thing is being changed, what do I want to do? So either way, whether you do it inline or you use a external function like this, the idea is the same. When this input is being changed, guess what? This is also an event. Because this is an event, I can also make use of the event object. The reason the event object is going to come in handy here is because as this input is being changed, right, I will be able to see what is the event target that triggered this particular event to change, right? What triggered this handle change? So now if I go back to my form, if I open up the inspector real fast and I go to our console and I go back to, I go back to my little, go to the console and I go back to my little link name input and I start typing in there, Cam's GitHub, you can start seeing that that console log with the event is coming back. And I'm clearly seeing that input and I'm getting back the ID, the name, all that stuff from that input is in there, right? Now, one of the pieces that's really important to know about inputs is by default, as an input is being typed in, there is a value that is being changed. The value of the input changes as you're typing in it. So if I were to say event.target.value, right, you'll see that as I start typing inside of this this URL box, now my console log is keeping track of the actual value of what's being changed, right? So this is how I can keep track of the value of the input. This value of the input is exactly what I'd love to set as my name. So I'd want to set the name to be the event.target.value. This will keep it, as you can see, it will keep an updated record of what is the most updated version of this particular piece of data, right? And by calling that set name function from the state, I'm thereby updating this value for the name to keep track of that over time, right? So similarly, I'm gonna need to do the same thing for the URL, right? So what if I just copy over this on change from here, right? Now, whenever either of these inputs is being called, I'm gonna have the handle change event be triggered. Clearly, I don't want to just set the name on both of these. So there's two ways I can do this. I could either redo this function to make it so I can track, hey, which input from the event.target got called and set either the name or set the URL. But first I need to have a new object here. So I'm just put one for the URL and I'm gonna also set the state to be empty. But like I was saying, I don't want, this handle change is very clearly just setting the name. I could update this function so it's more general and it could set either the name or it could set the URL based on which event.target was being clicked. Or just for the sake of time, I'm just gonna copy this function and just say, hey, handle URL change and handle name change. So now these things can be a little bit more unique. So clearly when the URL input gets changed, I wanna set the URL. But when the name is being changed, I wanna set the name. So here, down here, I'm gonna just update those function names, handle name change, handle URL change, right? So now, as I am typing into these inputs, right? So now I got Cam's GitHub and I have https://github.com/camunity. right? You can see all those things are being logged here. Not only my URL, but also above was for my input for the name. So now I have both of those pieces being tracked with these handler functions. The next thing that I want is to test now, well, what happens now when I submit the form? Because now I've submitted the form, I stopped it from reloading, but now I can console log and I'm using name and URL, but now those actually exist because I can use the state now to refer to those things. So if I save this and I go ahead and just make sure that this says Cam's GitHub again, just want to make sure that as I refresh that it still has the right values. Okay, it does. So when I submit this, right, now if I look in the submit, I can see it, hey, boom, I have both of those pieces. I have my name and the URL saved there, which is perfect because now with that name and that URL coming back, that means I have a reference to both of those pieces of data, which gives me now the ability to do something with those pieces of data. And again, what we want to do is I want to take these pieces of data. I don't want to just console log them. I want to send these to the table, right? Well, okay, how am I going to send these to the table? Theoretically, I need to send this from here all the way to here to save it as a prop for the link data, right? Because remember, we need to save this as a prop for it to show up in the table. So I need to send it to here as props. But all I have right now is just the form. So the missing piece here is I have to basically, from the form, I have to update the prop of the table. But to update the prop of the table, I need to go from the form back up to the link container and then down to the table. So this link container is a very important component because whenever something gets submitted, clearly I'm going to need to trigger it from the link container. I have to let the link container know. I have to say, hey, as a form, I got to say, hey, I have something to submit. And when it submits, it will pass in some data. And when that data comes, well, now I could use this link container to pass that data down to the table. So let's finish this up real quick so you can see the whole thing working as it would need to work. Here, let's say, for instance, I have an ability to say, okay, in order to send these to the table, I need to send it to the link container, right? So I need to send this to the link container, right? In order to do that, the only way to do that, again, only for sending one component to another component is props. So I have to define a prop in my form that will allow for me to call the link container. So I need a method or something that I can pass as a prop that says, hey, form, on new link or something, right? And whenever a new link is created in the form, I might say, hey, actually, why don't we call this handle submit function? You know what I'm saying? So I can say, oh, well, handle submit. So now the form has a prop called on new link, or, maybe like submit new link or something, right? Whenever the form is kind of tricky in the naming, but you'll see what I mean in a quick second, right? I'm creating this prop called submit new link. That means that in the form now, so long as I tell the form, hey, you're going to get some props, now the form could say, cool, on submit, what do I want to do? Well, I could say props dot on new link or submit new link. I think I called it, right? And submit new link is going to end up calling my handle submit, and the handle submit is expecting me to pass in some object in here. Well, here I could just pass in an object that has the name and the URL, just like this. With this information being passed, right, whenever the form is submitted, it's going to call this function in the link container handle submit that has a new link defined in it. The last piece I need is I need a way to make it so that the table's data will update based on whatever links this container, the link container, has. To do that, I'm going to also need to use some state. So the last step here is I need to say, okay, cool. If I use state from the React library, I could say, cool. Well, what if I had a array of all my fave links, right? And with that array of fave links, I could say, okay, cool. It'll start out empty, right? It'll start out as an empty array, but over time, we'll set a new fave link this way, right? Well, this gives me an array that I can use that I can say, hey, table, here is the array that you're going to use. It's going to be this fave links array that I just defined as a piece of state. But now, whenever the handle submit gets called for the form, right, and submit new link or whatever I ended up calling this gets called, right, handle submit is going to get a new fave link. And I'm going to say, okay, cool. Well, now I just want to set a new, I want to set this array of fave links to include this one that just got created. To do that, I could say, hey, you know, I could say set fave links, right? And I will say, hey, take all of the old links that you have. So I'll do this with a little array extra spread syntax. I'm going to create a new array, right? And I'm going to say, hey, that array is going to have all of the old stuff from our old fave links, and it will have our newest fave link that got added. So this is one way I could do this. Another way is I could say, hey, let's save fave links, and it could just be fave links. Yeah, fave links dot append, or I think it's push and push a new element, right? This adds a new element to the array. But the issue is with push, as you can see, it returns the new length of the array. So I wouldn't want to set fave links like this. I could do something like let new array get fave links dot push, and then push the fave link, right? And then I could either set fave links to here. I could set fave links like this, new array. So these are two ways you could do this. I'll comment this one out. This might be how I would have done it, but hopefully this one makes a little more sense to y'all who know about arrays. I could push data and set the new data, set that new array, right? This is a new array with that same data, but it's pushed a new item in it. And now setting the fave links array in state basically will say, oh, change this array, this fave links array. But because we pass that array down to the table as data, the table's cool, it's going to update. But the form now, whenever we submit a new link, should have the ability for us to add that new link to our table. Clearly, there's a little bit of an error. Linkdata.map is not a function. Let's see, what did I miss here? So we got our table body, props.data, that's cool. And then our link container and our table, we're passing fave links, yes. We have an array, and the array is empty. And then over time, we're pushing new data into our array and setting the new array. Okay, so that should be cool. Oh, my bad. So this is also messing up here. So let new array, fave links dot push. This returns the new array. Okay, so let me just, I'm gonna do this the other way. So instead of using the push, let me do it this way, because the push syntax is actually messing me up real quick. And then let's see if this actually works. All right, cool. So that works. I'll fix that. I'll fix this other way so that y'all can see. Let me close the console so y'all can see it easier now. So right now, given how we structured this, I have the ability to add a new link. So I can say, oh, let me add Google, right? HTTPS, google.com. And now I can say, and I have more links. The links will click because they're anchors, but that's cool. So that's awesome. So we're basically there. The only thing that you have to figure out if you're going to keep hacking on this is how to delete from that array. Just like we just added to the array, we got to figure out how to delete from the array. I think that the issue I was having before down here is, again, favlinks.push. This is going to allow for you to add to an array, but it is this method itself returns the length of the array. So theoretically, you might want to do something like, you could do something like you could say, maybe we could do like let new array. First, we could say like let new array get fave links. So it gets the old data, right? Then we can say new array dot push the new fave link, and then you could set the fave links to the new array like that. If you wanted to do it that way, this would be another way to do it. So this way that I was doing it is using the spread syntax. I think it's a little clean, right? So with this syntax, it says, I'm gonna create a new array. That array is gonna contain whatever was in the old array, comma, and this element. So that's like a pretty sophisticated newer way to do this. But this way I'm saying, hey, let me get the old fave links saved to a new array. Then I'm gonna push that new fave link that just came in and then, reset the state that way. So either way, as you can see, we now have the ability to edit and add to our array, to our fave links for our, we have the ability to add to our fave links table and use that data to then update our state for the table and use that from the form to change the information there. This is going to help us basically go ahead and create the backbone of this application using state and props. If you understand this concept alone, just understanding the concept of how we move from getting the data from the form to the table or getting data from the form saved in state, those are the core concepts in the React space that you're going to need to know. So long as you can keep practicing these simple concepts over and over and over again, trust me, over time, you're going to become a master at React. So yeah, I appreciate y'all for your time. Sorry at the the midnight hour of the code demo is going to mess up. Of course, that's how it goes. But I appreciate y'all for rocking with me. I'll send the code out over time so folks have some more time to kind of work on it. But I'll push it to GitHub and send you the link. Just send me a notice that you're interested in that. But appreciate y'all for your time and your attention. Feel free to stick around if you have some questions. Otherwise, I will see